Welcome to the ProTicker Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
I want you to take a moment and just think about the last 72 hours.
Yeah, it's been an unbelievable blur.
Just sit back and consider how quickly the ground beneath our feet can shift. Because we're looking at a world that was fundamentally altered over a single weekend in late February and early March of 2026.
Completely fundamentally altered.
Right. You might have seen the breaking news headlines, the flashes of light over Middle Eastern skylines on social media, the emergency press conferences from world leaders.
Right, the stuff that immediately grabs your attention.
Exactly. But what we're going to do today is look past those immediate chaotic images.
Because the real story is what happens next.
Yes, a single geopolitical flashpoint has just set off a chain reaction that is already affecting everything, from global energy markets down to the exact price of the item sitting in your online shopping carts right now.
It's a profound demonstration of how interconnected our modern world truly is. I mean, we often think of military conflicts as these isolated events, right?
Sure, happening on a map far away.
Exactly. Separated from our daily routines by oceans and continents. But the reality of 2026 is that a strike in the Persian Gulf ripples through the global nervous system at the speed of light.
And the speed of maritime shipping.
Yes. Today, our mission is to unpack these massive, cascading economic and supply chain shockwaves. We want to help you understand exactly why your cost of living, your business margins, and the broader stability of a global economy are shifting so dramatically.
Well, that's not just geopolitics. It's your wallet. It's your business. Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the economic earthquake, we first have to understand the kinetic spark that set it all off.
The military action.
Right. We have to go back to February 28th, 2026, the launch of a massive, coordinated military campaign. Now, I know there's been a lot of noise about this, but can you break down the actual scale of what happened that morning?
Yeah, the scale of what unfolded on that day is truly historic, and it's important to grasp the sheer magnitude of the force deployed here.
Give me the numbers.
The United States and Israel initiated a highly coordinated joint military operation. In the U.S. Department of Defense, it was codenamed Operation Epic Fury.
Epic Fury.
Right. And the Israeli military referred to their component as Operation Roaring Lion. We need to be clear about something. This was not a limited surgical strike.
Not a warning shot.
No, not a proportional response where a single facility is targeted as a message. This was an overwhelming, multi-domain offensive aimed squarely at the core of the Iranian state and its military infrastructure.
When you say multi-domain, what are we actually talking about? Because the reports I'm seeing are just staggering.
We're talking about an operation involving over 200 fighter jets.
200.
Over 200. We're talking about stealth B-2 bombers deployed to drop massive bunker buster munitions on deeply buried, heavily fortified targets.
The underground facilities.
Exactly. But crucially, the physical bombing was preceded by what is being described as the largest cyber attack in human history.
I want to pause on that cyber attack for a second, because the concept of a city going dark is something we see in movies, but the reality is terrifying. They essentially pulled the plug on Tehran, right?
Precisely. This cyber offensive literally plunged the capital city of Tehran and vast swaths of the country into total darkness.
Just blacked out the grid.
But it wasn't just the lights going out. It was the severing of communications grids, the blinding of radar systems, the paralysis of command and control networks.
So they couldn't even see it coming.
By the time the first physical munitions breached the airspace, the defensive infrastructure was effectively deaf, dumb, and blind.
Wow.
And the immediate primary outcome of this staggering display of force was the assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with the systematic decimation of the command structure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
It's hard to overstate the gravity of that outcome, but to really grasp why this happened, we have to look at the runway leading up to February 28th. How did we get to the point where an operation of this magnitude was given the green light?
It is essential to place this event in its precise historical context. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't a sudden, impulsive decision.
It's been building for a while.
Exactly. The lead up to February 2026 was marked by a steady, relentless escalation of tensions. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look back to the brief but intense 12-day war in 2025.
Right.
That conflict saw direct exchanges of fire and highly damaging strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities.
And after that 2025 conflict, there was an attempt to cool things down, correct? the negotiations in Geneva.
Yes. Following the 12-Day War, there were highly anticipated indirect nuclear negotiations held in Geneva. The international community placed a lot of hope on those talks to establish a new framework for de-escalation.
But they failed.
They ultimately failed to produce a viable agreement, and that left a massive diplomatic vacuum.
And while the diplomacy was failing abroad, things were unraveling domestically inside Iran. In January of 2026, the country saw some of the largest internal protests since the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Massive unrest.
Right. And the state response was severe. Thousands of casualties as the government attempted to maintain control. It was during this period of intense domestic unrest that U.S. President Donald Trump publicly pledged to the protesters that, quote, help is on the way.
Which established the public posture of the U.S. administration leading into the late February strikes.
But behind the scenes, the decision-making process within the Oval Office provides a fascinating window into the competing priorities. Because it wasn't a unanimous march to war, was it?
Not at all. Reporting indicates there was significant high-level debate regarding the potential fallout of such a massive strike.
Who was pushing back?
Well, for instance, Tucker Carlson, a prominent media figure and close ally of the president, reportedly met with President Trump on multiple occasions to advise strongly against the operation.
What was the core of his argument against the strike? Was it purely political?
No, his arguments were deeply rooted in strategic and economic pragmatism. He reportedly centered his warnings on 3 pillars.
Okay, what were they?
First, the severe, immediate risks to U.S. military personnel deployed across various bases in the region. Second, the inevitable catastrophic spike in global energy prices.
Which we will definitely get into.
Right. And third, the potential destabilization of Arab partner nations in the Gulf who rely on U.S. security umbrellas but desperately want to avoid a regional war.
Yet, despite those explicit warnings specifically about the energy markets and regional stability, the decision was made to proceed with Operation Epic Fury.
The president later stated publicly that he expects the military campaign could last 4 to 5 weeks.
And when critics suggested he might lose interest or stamina for a prolonged engagement,
He dismissed them by asserting, quote, "I don't get bored."
So, the strike happens. The supreme leader is killed. The IRGC command structure is hit. But here is where the narrative shifts from a localized military action to a global economic crisis. It's the Iranian retaliation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't what most people expected, was it?
What's fascinating here is the strategic logic behind Iran's response. From a purely conventional military standpoint, Iran cannot win a direct symmetrical confrontation with the combined air and naval power of the United States and Israel.
They just don't have the hardware.
Their strategists know this perfectly well. Therefore, their retaliation was not designed to achieve conventional military victory. They aren't trying to shoot down every American jet or sink an aircraft carrier in a head-to-head battle.
So what's the play?
Their strategy was designed to inflict maximum regional and, by extension, global economic pain.
So instead of just firing back at Israel or trying to hit a U.S. base in Iraq or Syria like we've seen in the past, they widened the aperture.
Exactly. Instead of limiting their counterstrikes to Israeli territory or direct U.S. military assets in isolation, Iran made the calculated decision to expand the war zone across the entire Persian Gulf.
A massive expansion.
They launched a massive barrage of ballistic missiles and suicide drones, and they targeted the broader neighborhood. They hit the United Arab Emirates. They hit Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar. They even targeted British military bases on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean.
By hitting all these neighboring states that, for the most part, explicitly wanted nothing to do with this conflict and had sought to remain neutral, what was the message Iran was sending?
The message was brutal but strategically coherent. If our security is shattered and our economy is destroyed, we will ensure the entire region burns with us.
Wow.
By hitting neutral Arab states, Iran essentially forced a crisis that the global economy could no longer ignore or compartmentalize. They weaponized the geography of the Middle East against the global supply chain.
And the collateral damage to civilian and corporate infrastructure was immediate and deeply shocking.
Completely unprecedented.
That brings us to one of the most surreal aspects of the first 48 hours. When you think of a Middle Eastern conflict, you picture military bases, airfields, maybe oil refineries.
Yeah.
But we saw direct hits on the digital and physical monuments of global commerce.
Yes.
During the missile strikes on the UAE, Amazon AWS data centers caught fire.
This is a critical point that perfectly illustrates the vulnerability of our modern economy. We talk about the cloud all the time.
Right, like it's this invisible thing.
We think of it as this ethereal, untouchable thing floating above the fray. But the cloud is just someone else's computer.
And those computers live in massive warehouses.
Highly specialized, hyper-cooled physical buildings on the ground.
Can you explain the technical side of why this hit was so devastating? Because I know AWS is built to withstand outages. They talk about redundancy all the time.
They do, and it comes down to a concept called availability zones. In cloud architecture, an availability zone is essentially a discrete data center with redundant power, networking, and connectivity.
Right?
Cloud providers build multiple availability zones in a region so that if one facility loses power or has a fire, the traffic automatically reroutes to the others. The end user never notices a thing.
Because it's designed to withstand a single point of failure.
The infrastructure is designed to withstand the failure of a single zone.
But military-grade ballistic missiles don't care about cloud architecture diagrams.
Exactly. The Iranian strikes targeted multiple data centers across different availability zones simultaneously.
Taking them all out at once.
Because the regional network was only designed to handle the redundancy of a single zone failing, the simultaneous destruction of multiple facilities caused a catastrophic cascading failure.
And what goes down when that happens?
Essential cloud storage, corporate databases, financial transaction ledgers, and basic web hosting across the Middle East went completely offline.
Unbelievable. And it wasn't just the digital infrastructure either. We saw iconic civilian infrastructure damage. The Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai.
The sail-shaped building.
Literally one of the most recognizable luxury symbols in the world, sitting right there on its own artificial island. It sustained damage. I think that image, more than anything, shatters the illusion of Dubai as this untouched, safe haven for global capital.
It undeniably shatters it. Dubai has spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars marketing itself as the Switzerland of the Middle East.
A neutral playground.
A neutral playground for international business, luxury tourism, and global logistics. But when you have vacationers, international business hubs, and the literal backbone of the regional internet all caught in the crossfire of a ballistic missile exchange,
that reputation evaporates overnight.
Overnight.
It's a terrifying paradigm shift. But as terrifying and disruptive as the strikes on the UAE and Saudi Arabia were, they pale in comparison to the true economic weapon that was deployed.
The choke point.
Right. And that brings us to the absolute core of this deep dive, the 21-mile stretch of water that essentially dictates the heartbeat of global capitalism.
We are speaking, of course, about the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes.
If you want to understand why global markets panicked within hours of Operation Epic Fury, you must understand the geography, the mathematics, and the absolute irreplicability of this specific waterway.
I think a lot of people, when they hear Persian Gulf or Strait of Hormuz, they picture a massive, wide open ocean. Can you paint a picture of what this geography actually looks like? How tight is this choke point?
It is incredibly tight, and that is its fundamental vulnerability. The Strait of Hormuz is located between the Musandam Peninsula, which is shared by Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the southern side, and the southern coast of Iran on the northern side.
Okay.
It serves as the sole maritime connection between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, leading out into the Arabian Sea and the open ocean. At its narrowest point, the physical land-to-land distance is only 21 miles wide.
21 miles. That's roughly the distance of a half marathon.
Exactly.
But ships can't use all 21 miles.
Yeah. Not even close. The waters are shallow and treacherous near the coasts. The actual shipping lanes, the deep water channels required for a fully loaded supertanker drawing 70 feet of water to safely navigate, are incredibly narrow.
How narrow?
The inbound shipping lane is only 2 miles wide. The outbound shipping lane is only 2 miles wide.
2 miles.
And they are separated by a 2-mile buffer zone to prevent collisions. So the functional navigable width of this global artery is essentially a needle's eye.
Okay, so we have this tiny needle's eye. Just how much of the world's economy is trying to thread that needle every single day?
Through that incredibly narrow channel flows the lifeblood of the industrialized world. Under normal conditions, approximately 20 million barrels of oil transit through the strait every single day.
Cruddy million.
To put that massive number into perspective, that is roughly 20% of the entire world's daily petroleum consumption.
1/5 of all the oil.
1 out of every 5 barrels of oil used on planet Earth goes through those 2-mile wide lanes.
And it's not just crude oil, right? Natural gas is a huge factor here, too.
Yes, and arguably, the natural gas aspect is even more critical for certain parts of the world, specifically Europe.
Right.
The strait is the conduit for 20% of the global supply of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, primarily originating from the massive gas fields of Qatar. It is, without exaggeration, the single most critical, irreplaceable maritime choke point on Earth.
So immediately following the U.S. and Israeli strikes, what exactly happens to the strait? How does Iran respond on the water?
The IRGC immediately broadcasts warnings over open maritime VHF radio frequencies. These are the standard communication channels monitored by every commercial vessel.
What did they say?
The message was chillingly simple and direct. No ship is allowed to pass the Strait of Hormuz. Furthermore, they explicitly threaten to set ablaze or sink any vessel that attempts the transit, viewing any commercial movement as a potential threat or an act of defiance.
Now, here is where it gets incredibly nuanced and important to understand. But wait, if it's not physically blocked by sunken ships, why can't a massive shipping conglomerate like Maersk or a major state-backed oil tanker just say, look, we have a massive ship, we're not a military target, we'll take our chances and sail through anyway?
That is the crucial distinction, and it's the invisible mechanism that governs global trade. We are dealing with a de facto blockade.
De facto.
The strait is functionally closed not by a physical wall of steel or sunken concrete, but by an impenetrable wall of unacceptable financial and physical risk. And the mechanism enforcing this blockade wasn't solely the Iranian fast attack boats or coastal missile batteries.
What was it?
It was the international maritime insurance market.
Let's unpack that. Explain the insurance angle to me like I'm 5, because I think most people don't realize that shipping companies don't just put a boat in the water and hope for the best.
Global shipping operates on a complex, highly regulated web of insurance. You have basic marine hull insurance, which covers the ship itself against storms or collisions.
Like car insurance.
Right. But when a ship enters a designated high-risk area, it requires a specialized product called a war risk premium. When a shipping company wants to send a massive oil tanker into the Persian Gulf, they have to purchase this specific coverage.
And these aren't small investments. What kind of money are we talking about for one of these ships and its cargo?
Let's look at the math of fear. A modern, very large crude carrier, or VLCC, might be worth $120 million just for the steel of the ship itself.
Just the boat.
Just the boat. The cargo of crude oil it's carrying can easily be worth another $100 million or more. So you have $250 million floating asset. But before the conflict, the war risk premium for transiting the Gulf was relatively low, historically around 0.125% of the ship's value.
Which is still a chunk of change, but considered a standard cost of doing business. But what happened to those premiums after the missiles started flying and the radio warnings were broadcast?
Almost overnight, the actuarial math completely inverted. Those premiums surged to between 0.25 and 0.5%, and in some specific cases, even higher.
That's a massive jump.
To translate those percentages into real dollars, for that $120 million vessel, a single trip through the strait suddenly required hundreds of thousands of dollars in extra, completely unbudgeted insurance costs.
So it becomes financially ruinous to make the trip. But it went beyond just exorbitant costs, didn't it? It wasn't just that the toll went up.
Exactly. The situation deteriorated past the point of pricing the risk. Major global insurance providers, massive institutions like Marsh, began issuing cancellation notices entirely.
They just pulled the plug.
They simply refused to underwrite the risk at any price. From an insurance standpoint, you cannot calculate the odds of survival when a sophisticated military force has explicitly broadcasted its intention to destroy any vessel in a specific 2-mile-wide channel.
Right.
Without active insurance, a commercial vessel legally, practically, and financially cannot sail. Lenders will recall their loans, flags of registry will be pulled, and crews will rightfully refuse to board.
Think of it like a major global highway. Imagine the most important, heavily trafficked interstate in your country. Technically, the asphalt is totally clear.
Yeah.
There are no barricades, no overturned trucks blocking the lanes.
Open road.
But the toll to enter has suddenly been raised to $1 million. And then your auto insurance company calls you directly and says, listen, if you drive your car onto that specific highway, your policy is completely void.
Yeah,
If your car is destroyed, you are 100% on your own.
right.
What happens? Nobody drives on it. The result is total gridlock, even on an open road.
That is a perfect analogy. And the illustrative data from the first 72 hours of the crisis confirms this exact scenario playing out on a massive scale.
What do numbers look like?
On a normal day, the Strait of Hormuz sees approximately 107 large commercial transits. Following the initiation of Operation Epic Fury and the subsequent Iranian threats, maritime tracking data showed that traffic plummeted by up to 86%.
86% drop.
At one point, observers noted only a tiny handful of small, perhaps localized or highly specialized vessels attempting the crossing.
Meanwhile, a massive ghost fleet materialized. I saw satellite imagery of this, and it's eerie. Hundreds of enormous, multi-million-dollar oil tankers and cargo ships simply dropped anchor and idled in the Gulf of Oman, just outside the strait,
Just
waiting for a diplomatic or military resolution that was nowhere in sight. They were terrified to go in, and the ships that were already deep inside the Persian Gulf loading up at terminals in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait were terrified to come out.
The sudden, violent strangulation of the world's primary energy artery triggered what can only be described as a macroeconomic earthquake. When you instantly remove the potential for 20 million barrels of oil per day to reach the global market, the financial systems do not just adjust. They react with absolute, unmitigated panic.
Let's talk about that panic, because this is where the geopolitical strike in Tehran hits the trading floors in London and New York. The commodity markets went absolutely wild.
Oh, instantly.
Brent crude, which is the international benchmark for oil prices, jumped nearly 10% almost instantly, hovering around $80 a barrel right out of but that was just the initial shockwave, right?
That 10% jump was merely the market trying to process the headlines of the first few hours. The real fear set in when analysts began modeling the duration of the disruption. Major financial analysts from institutions like Bernstein and JP Morgan began issuing dire warnings to their institutional clients.
What were they predicting?
Their models suggested that if this de facto blockade persists, if those tankers stay parked in the Gulf of Oman for weeks rather than days, we could see crude oil spike to $100, $120, or even $150 a barrel.
And when we talk about crude oil prices spiking, I want to briefly explain what that actually means for the physical ships trying to move goods around the world. We hear a lot about bunker fuel. What is that, and why does an oil spike make shipping so much more expensive immediately?
It's an excellent question. Bunker fuel is essentially the lifeblood of global logistics. When crude oil is refined, the lighter, higher quality products like gasoline and jet fuel are extracted first.
Right.
What's left over at the bottom of the refining process is a thick, heavy, highly viscous residual oil. This is bunker fuel. It is incredibly energy dense, but it is also the fuel that powers the massive, slow-speed diesel engines of global cargo ships.
So it's essentially the sludgy leftovers, but these massive ships burn an unbelievable amount of it.
Precisely. A large container ship can burn upwards of 100 to 150 tons of bunker fuel every single day at sea.
Tons. Per day.
So when the price of Brent crude spikes by 10 or 20%, the cost of bunker fuel skyrockets in tandem. The daily operating cost of moving a ship from Asia to Europe inflates massively overnight, entirely separate from the insurance costs we just discussed.
Okay, so crude is spiking, bunker fuel is spiking, but the crisis was not limited to oil. The liquefied natural gas markets experienced an even more dramatic shock. Remember earlier we mentioned that Qatar relies almost entirely on the strait to export its LNG?
Yes. And during the wave of Iranian retaliation, a drone attack specifically targeted Qatari infrastructure. This forced Qatar to temporarily halt production at Ras Laffan, which happens to be the world's largest LNG export facility.
The largest in the world.
The impact on global markets, and specifically on Europe, was instantaneous and brutal.
European natural gas prices surged by an astonishing 55%. Europe had spent the last 4 years aggressively pivoting to LNG following the loss of Russian pipeline gas in 2022.
Exact.
They had built new terminals, signed massive contracts with Qatar, and thought they had secured their energy independence. Suddenly, they found their alternative lifeline severed.
This is where we see the cascading vulnerabilities of energy transitions. Europe solved its Russian pipeline problem by relying on Qatari maritime shipments, only to discover that maritime shipping through a 21-mile choke point carries its own catastrophic risks.
So we have oil prices rocketing upward toward $100 a barrel, and natural gas prices in Europe jumping 55%.
But how does that connect to the listener sitting at home, maybe not trading Brent crude futures or managing a European utility company?
Right.
It connects through the most insidious, unavoidable economic force of all: inflation.
Exactly. The commodity spike is not an isolated financial event contained to spreadsheets in New York or London. It is a highly contagious economic pathogen.
Spreading everywhere. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Energy is the foundational input for literally everything in the modern economy. It costs fuel to harvest crops with diesel tractors. It costs fuel to manufacture physical goods in factories.
And to move them.
It costs bunker fuel to move those goods across oceans. And it costs diesel to transport those goods on trucks to your local store or your front porch.
JP Morgan and Oxford Economics have actually run the historical numbers on this correlation. Their estimates show that for every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil, you trigger a 0.15 to 0.5 percentage point rise in overall global inflation.
It acts as a massive, unavoidable tax on the entire global supply chain. It doesn't matter what you are buying. If oil goes up, the cost to get that item to you goes up.
And this inflationary threat arrived at the absolute worst possible moment for global central banks. Think back to early 2026, just weeks prior to this conflict erupting.
The narrative was so different.
The overarching narrative in the financial press, the sentiment driving the stock market, was that the post-pandemic inflation dragon had finally been tamed. The markets had confidently priced in multiple interest rate cuts from the U.S. Federal Reserve.
Expecting borrowing costs to finally come down and relieve the pressure on consumers.
I remember that optimism clearly. People were getting ready to refinance their homes. Businesses were planning to take out loans for expansion. But the moment the Strait of Hormuz froze, that optimism evaporated instantly.
Completely gone.
Money markets aggressively repriced reality. The probability of the Fed cutting rates 3 times in 2026 plummeted from 50% down to just 20% in a matter of days.
And other central banks followed suit.
The Bank of England and the European Central Bank mirrored this panic, signaling heavily that rates would have to stay higher for much longer to combat this new energy-driven inflation wave.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that the financial relief you were expecting is gone. Because central banks are forced to delay rate cuts to fight the inflation caused by $100 a barrel oil, the cost of borrowing money remains painfully high.
Everything stays expensive.
That adjustable rate mortgage you have, it stays expensive. The interest rate on your credit card balance, which is already likely at a record high, it's not coming down. That auto loan you were hoping to get for a new car to commute to work. The monthly payment just got pushed out of reach because the financing costs remain elevated.
It's the butterfly effect in its purest, most brutal form. A bunker buster bomb drops in Tehran. A marine insurance actuary sitting at a desk in London cancels a policy, and your mortgage payment in Ohio stays elevated for another 2 years.
It's mind-blowing when you trace the exact path of cause and effect.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The pain isn't just coming from the macroeconomic cost of energy or central bank policy. The invisible web of global logistics, the actual physical movement of the stuff we buy every day, is tearing apart at the seams. Let's talk about the supply chain and the nightmare unfolding in the e-commerce sector.
To understand the true logistics nightmare, we have to look at how the major shipping conglomerates are reacting to the uninsurable risk of the Middle East. We discussed how the Strait of Hormuz is closed to traffic, but the major global shipping giants, companies like Maersk, MSC, and Hapag-Lloyd, have made the sweeping strategic decision to avoid the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the surrounding conflict zones entirely.
Right. But in global shipping, you can't just take a quick detour down a side street or take the next exit. If you are a massive container ship originating in Shenzhen, China, loaded with 20,000 containers of electronics, clothing, and auto parts, and you are destined for Rotterdam or New York, the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea are your primary routes.
The main highways.
If those are closed, what is your only other option?
The only viable alternative for moving massive volumes of goods between Asia and Europe or Asia and the east coast of the Americas is to divert the container ships all the way around the southern tip of Africa, navigating the Cape of Good Hope.
And we need to emphasize what a monumental detour that actually is.
It is staggering. Diverting around the Cape of Good Hope adds approximately 3,500 nautical miles to the journey.
Wow.
In terms of time, it adds 10 to 14 days of transit time. And that's assuming good weather, which is rare in the notoriously rough waters off the southern coast of Africa.
So they're going faster to make up time.
Exactly. Because these ships are running at much higher speeds to try and make up for the lost time over a vastly longer distance, they require up to 30% more fuel.
Which, as we just established, is bunker fuel that has just skyrocketed in price because of the oil shock. So you are burning 30% more of a fuel that just got significantly more expensive. Plus, you're paying a crew for an extra 2 weeks. And you are entirely messing up the scheduling of the destination ports in Europe and America, causing massive localized congestion.
Right, and those monumental extra costs do not just disappear into the ether. They are immediately passed down the chain to the businesses importing the goods.
Immediately.
Within days of the diversion announcements, the ocean carriers began slapping what they call emergency conflict surcharges on every single container booked. Depending on the carrier, the specific route, and the type of cargo, these surcharges range from $1,500 to $4,000 per container.
So base shipping costs are exploding, but it's about to get so much worse, specifically for American consumers and businesses, because these logistical costs are slamming headfirst into a brand new, incredibly aggressive tariff environment in the United States.
The perfect storm.
We have to look at the math of how these factors are compounding on imported goods in 2026. Can you break down the tariff situation?
It really is a perfect storm of cost multipliers. First, you have the existing Section 301 tariffs. These are the legacy tariffs primarily on Chinese goods that were implemented during the previous trade wars.
The ones people are somewhat familiar with.
Right. Depending on the specific product category, these tariffs range from an additional 7.5% to 25% tax on the value of the imported goods. Then, in early 2026, a newly imposed Section 122 tariff added an across-the-board 15% penalty on a wide swath of imports.
Okay, so we have layered tariffs. But perhaps most significantly for direct-to-consumer e-commerce, the government eliminated what is known as the $800 de minimis exemption.
Yes.
Let's unpack that de minimis rule, because I feel like most people utilize this rule constantly without ever knowing its name.
It was essentially the great loophole of modern global e-commerce. Previously, under the de minimis rule, if a package was shipped directly from a foreign factory to a U.S. consumer, and the total value of that package was under $800, it entered the country completely duty-free.
Completely bypassing customs.
It bypassed the massive tariff structures entirely and required minimal customs paperwork.
I will fully admit I am guilty of abusing this.
Hmm.
You go on one of those fast fashion apps, or you buy some completely questionable 3D printed LED desk lamp for $12 directly from a factory in Shenzhen, and it magically shows up at your door 2 weeks later with no extra taxes.
Everyone did.
That was the de minimis rule in action. It was the regulatory loophole that allowed ultra-fast fashion and cheap direct-to-consumer electronics to absolutely flood the market over the last 5 years.
Exactly. But with that exemption entirely eliminated in 2026, the game completely changed. Every single package, whether it is a $10,000 piece of industrial machinery or a $12 LED desk lamp, now requires full customs clearance, formal entry procedures, and faces the brutally stacked Section 301 and Section 122 tariffs.
Okay, we need to bridge this macro geopolitical theory directly to the micro reality of a business owner. Let's walk through the exact life cycle of a single consumer product. Let's imagine an e-commerce business selling a standard mid-tier kitchen blender.
Okay, a blender.
Let's say it costs the brand $10 to manufacture this blender in a factory in China. Walk me through the math of what happens to that blender now.
Let's illustrate this compounding nightmare. Before the crisis, our $10 blender gets loaded into a shipping container in Shenzhen. The per-unit cost to ship that single item across the Pacific, amortized across the thousands of items in the container, might have been $1.50.
Okay, $1.50.
So your landed cost in Los Angeles is $11.50.
Right.
But now, because of the Cape of Good Hope rerouting, the massive spike in bunker fuel prices, and the emergency conflict surcharges of up to $4,000 per container, that per-unit shipping cost jumps dramatically. Let's say it jumps from $1.50 to $3.50.
Okay, so the geopolitical conflict has pushed our base cost to $13.50 before the blender even clears customs. Now we apply the new 2026 tariff stack.
Correct. Let's say this specific blender faces a combined 22.5% in duties from the accumulated Section 301 and Section 122 rules. You apply that 22.5% tax to the manufacturing cost. That adds another $2.25 to the cost of the item.
So let's look at the final tally. Your $10 product, which used to cost $11.50 to land in your U.S. warehouse, now costs $15.75.
Right.
That is almost a 40% jump in the total landed cost of the exact same product, caused entirely by a combination of a missile strike in the Middle East and a change in customs regulations.
This raises an important question. How do businesses survive this?
They don't have massive cushions.
The vast majority of e-commerce businesses, specifically direct-to-consumer retail brands, do not operate on massive, luxurious margins. A healthy net profit margin for a mid-sized retail brand is often around 10 to 12%.
So a 40% cost increase just obliterates that.
When your core landed costs jump by nearly 40% overnight, your profitability is not just reduced, it is entirely erased. You are operating at a severe loss the moment the shipping container is unloaded at the port.
So if you are the CEO of this blender company, your natural immediate reaction is to pass those costs on to the consumer. You either raise the baseline price of the blender on your website or you jack up the shipping and handling fees at checkout.
You have to. But here is the friction point. Consumers are already squeezed by the macro inflation we talked about earlier. They are already paying more for groceries, more for gas, and their credit card interest rates are sky high. So what happens when this stressed consumer gets to the digital checkout counter and sees those newly inflated prices?
They bail.
They just leave.
The data on consumer behavior post-crisis is startling and incredibly consistent. Cart abandonment rates across e-commerce platforms begin hitting upwards of 70%.
70%.
7 out of every 10 people who put an item in their digital cart leave without paying. And when surveyed by retail analytics firms, half of those consumers explicitly cited extra costs, meaning surprise shipping fees, taxes, and duties calculated at the very end of the checkout process as the primary reason they closed the browser window.
The psychological threshold of the consumer has simply been breached.
Totally breached. So if you are running an e-commerce business right now, you are trapped in a vice. How do you navigate a world where your baseline costs are up 40%, your profit margins are vaporized, and 70% of your customers are walking away at the register? It feels like an impossible scenario. It becomes a game of extreme, granular operational survival.
Absolutely. The focus for these businesses has to shift immediately and aggressively. In a normal economic environment, the focus is on aggressive customer acquisition, spending heavily on Facebook or Google ads to drive new traffic.
Growth at all costs.
Right. But when conversion rates are plummeting to 30%, customer acquisition becomes wildly unprofitable. You are paying for clicks that don't convert. Therefore, the strategy must pivot entirely to absolute retention and checkout optimization.
What did that actually look like in practice for a business?
It means you must optimize the checkout experience to prevent that specific sticker shock. Perhaps a business needs to blend the shipping costs into the product price earlier in the funnel, offering quote-unquote free shipping on a slightly more expensive item, because consumers psychologically hate surprise fees at the final step.
We all hate that extra $5 at the end.
Exactly. Furthermore, they need incredibly intelligent payment routing. When a customer does finally decide to buy, the transaction simply cannot fail due to a gateway error or a false fraud flag. Every single converted sale is precious.
And perhaps the most critical survival tactic we are seeing companies adopt is aggressive dunning. For those who aren't in the SaaS or subscription e-commerce space, dunning is the automated process of recovering failed payments. Why is this so crucial right now?
Think about a subscription business, maybe a monthly coffee delivery or a software service. On average, a healthy subscription business naturally loses about 10% of its recurring revenue simply to failed credit card payments.
Just cards failing.
Cards expire, they get lost and replaced, they get flagged by overzealous fraud algorithms, or the consumer hits their credit limit.
In a boom economy, maybe a business ignores that 10% churn because they are acquiring new customers so fast.
Exactly. But when your margins are evaporating because of a war in the Middle East and a massive tariff spike, you can no longer afford to ignore that leakage.
You need every dollar.
Recovering that 10% of lost revenue isn't just a best practice for optimization. It is literally the difference between making payroll next month and going bankrupt. Aggressive dunning software that automatically reaches out to customers to update their payment methods becomes a lifeline. Retaining the subscribers you already fought so hard to acquire is paramount to survival.
It's a stark, fascinating reality. The geopolitical chaos unleashed by Operation Epic Fury has transformed the daily operational checklist of a mid-size e-commerce manager into a high-stakes crisis management scenario.
They're fighting a war of attrition on their Shopify dashboards.
They really are. But as we look at how individual businesses are adapting to this new reality, we also have to look at how nations are adapting. The 2026 Iran conflict is forcing a geopolitical reshuffling that will dictate the future of global energy for decades to come. Let's zoom back out to the macro level.
That is the essential transition to make. The ripple effects of the Strait of Hormuz paralysis aren't just hitting the consumers in the United States and Europe. They are slamming into Asia with terrifying force, and it is exposing massive vulnerabilities in global alliances.
Especially in China.
China, in particular, is facing a quiet, profound crisis regarding its energy security.
We hear so much about the US and Europe, but Asian economies, specifically China, India, and Japan, are overwhelmingly, almost existentially reliant on the Strait of Hormuz. What do the numbers look like for China specifically?
The dependency is staggering. Over 50% of China's entire oil import volume transits through that 21-mile gap.
50%.
They are the factory floor of the world, and that factory runs on Middle Eastern crude. This dependency places Beijing in a highly complex, highly uncomfortable strategic bind.
Why is it a bind? Because China and Iran have historically been fairly close, right? They are often aligned in their opposition to U.S. geopolitical influence. They've signed massive, long-term economic agreements in recent years.
They have maintained a strategic partnership, yes. However, this crisis has illuminated the absolute limits of that partnership.
When push comes to shove.
When the core economic lifeblood of the Chinese state, its access to cheap, reliable energy, is directly threatened by Iranian military actions and the resulting insurance gridlock, ideological alignment takes a back seat. The limits of the partnership are immediately exposed.
We actually saw this play out diplomatically, didn't we? It wasn't just theoretical.
Indeed. Behind the scenes and occasionally spilling into public diplomatic readouts, China was quietly, but incredibly forcefully, pressing Iran to de-escalate and keep the strait open to commercial traffic.
Who was leading that?
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi reportedly engaged in intense, continuous communications with his counterparts in Tehran. The underlying message from Beijing was essentially, we support you politically in the international arena, but you cannot destroy our domestic economy in the process of your retaliation.
It perfectly proves the old adage that nations don't have permanent friends, they only have permanent interests. When push comes to shove, cold, hard economic reality trumps ideological alliances every single time.
Every time.
But China's panic also highlights a terrifying realization for global energy planners everywhere. There are very real physical limits to the alternatives. When the strait is closed, the immediate question everyone asks is, can we just go around it? Can we just pump the oil out through overland pipelines to different ports and bypass the danger zone entirely?
And the sobering answer is yes, but only a tiny fraction of it. The global infrastructure was simply not built for a prolonged closure of Hormuz. Let's look at the actual bypass infrastructure that exists today.
Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline, right? I know that was built specifically for this kind of scenario.
Yes, Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline, also known as Petrolene. It stretches entirely across the Arabian Peninsula, taking crude from the eastern oil fields near the Persian Gulf and delivering it to export terminals on the Red Sea coast, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz.
And the UAE has one too.
The United Arab Emirates has a similar, though smaller, strategic pipeline running from its inland fields to the port of Fujairah, which sits on the Gulf of Oman, safely outside the strait.
Okay, so we have pipelines. Why isn't that enough to calm the markets?
Because of the critical math problem of volume capacity. The massive Saudi East-West pipeline can only handle about 6.5 million barrels a day at its absolute maximum theoretical capacity. The UAE pipeline can handle maybe another 1.5 million barrels.
So if you max out every bypass pipe in the region, you can move maybe 8 million barrels safely. But the strait normally handles 20 million barrels a day.
Precisely. If you normally need to move 20 million barrels to keep the global economy functioning, and your emergency bypass systems can only handle 8 million, you are left with a deficit of 12 million barrels of oil every single day that are essentially stranded in the Persian Gulf.
Just stuck there.
It is physically trapped. There are not enough pipes, not enough tanker trucks, not enough alternative infrastructure on Earth to move that staggering volume of energy without physically sailing ships through the Strait of Hormuz.
And that realization, the mathematical proof that the world is trapped, is the structural shift that will define the next decade of geopolitics. The world woke up in March 2026 and collectively realized that the entire global economy is uniquely, dangerously hostage to a 21-mile stretch of water.
Hostage.
A choke point that can be completely shut down not by a massive naval armada, but by a few radio broadcasts from the IRGC and a sudden spike in actuarial risk models from insurance companies in London. The systemic risk is simply too high to tolerate any longer.
This crisis will undoubtedly act as a massive historic catalyst for change. The vulnerability has been laid bare. We are going to see nations aggressively accelerate policies and deploy massive capital investments designed to permanently eliminate what we can essentially call Hormuz risk.
What does eliminating Hormuz risk actually look like on a macroeconomic scale over the next 10 years?
It means a fundamental pivot in how nations power themselves and source their goods. It means a massive state-sponsored influx of capital into next-generation nuclear energy, specifically small modular reactors, to guarantee baseline domestic power.
Clean, local power.
It means an unprecedented wartime-level acceleration in the deployment of renewable energy grids and battery storage. And crucially, it means a fundamental restructuring of domestic supply chains. Nations will legislate and incentivize bringing critical manufacturing back home to ensure they are not reliant on vulnerable global shipping lanes traversing conflict zones.
So what does this all mean for us today? Let's recap the staggering butterfly effect we've explored over the course of this deep dive. We started with a targeted, massively destructive military strike on a single weekend in late February, Operation Epic Fury.
Right.
We saw how Iran's strategic, calculated decision to retaliate against neutral Gulf states and threaten maritime shipping instantly paralyzed the Strait of Hormuz. And crucially, they achieved this not with physical sunken blockades, but with the terrifying math of uninsurable risk.
From there, we traced how that maritime gridlock caused an immediate macroeconomic earthquake. We watched it send global oil prices surging toward $100 a barrel, triggering massive natural gas spikes in Europe, and forcing central banks around the world to panic and abandon their planned interest rate cuts.
Which hits the consumer directly.
This macro shift directly impacted the borrowing costs, the mortgages, and the auto loans of everyday citizens. We then followed the rerouted cargo ships as they embarked on the massive, costly detour around the Cape of Good Hope.
Watching as exploding fuel surcharges and aggressive new 2026 tariffs compounded to absolutely obliterate the profit margins of e-commerce businesses. We saw how these massive geopolitical shifts forced small business owners to fight for daily survival at the digital checkout counter through tactics like dunning and cart optimization.
It is a vivid, undeniable, and frankly terrifying lesson in how fragile our hyper-connected world truly is. A geopolitical decision made in a secure war room half a world away dictates the price of your groceries, the viability of your favorite online business, the stability of the Chinese economy, and the strategic direction of global superpowers.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this entire crisis raises an important question, a final, provocative thought for you to consider long after we sign off.
If physical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea before it are becoming permanent zones of uninsurable risk, are we actually witnessing the end of physical globalization as we know it? Consider a future, perhaps not too distant, where the traditional steel shipping container is entirely replaced by the data packet.
That's fascinating.
Imagine a world where nations gradually stop moving manufactured goods across dangerous, contested oceans entirely. Instead, they only transmit secure digital blueprints across networks, allowing goods to be 3D printed, assembled, and automated in hyperlocal fortress economies. The ultimate defense against a closed strait or a frozen ocean isn't building a bigger navy. It's engineering a society that never needs the cargo ship in the first place.
Wow. Let me just chew on that for a second. A world where the data packet replaces the shipping container. You look around your room right now, your lamp, your chair, your phone case. All of it arrived on a ship that had to navigate these massive oceanic choke points.
Every piece of it.
To think that in 10 or 20 years, those items won't be shipped as physical objects, but transmitted as code to a localized 3D printing hub in your own city, simply because the oceans became too financially risky to cross. That is a truly mind-expanding concept. It makes you look at every physical item in your house and every breaking news headline on your feed in a completely different light.
It really does.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the kinetic military realities of the Persian Gulf to the highly specific checkout optimization strategies of your favorite online store. We encourage you to keep exploring these connections on your own, keep questioning how the macro global events affect your micro daily life, and keep diving deeper. See you next time.